So, this happened years ago when I was a dumb teenage girl who loved walking the city alone after dark. This took place in Eastern Europe for context, in a city with a tramway system. On this one night, I was in the station waiting to catch the last tram home. The 3 trams stopped at the station, 2 of which went where I was going. That'll be important for later. It was around 10 p.m. and as I sat there waiting, lost in thought, I barely registered a man quietly walking up and standing by the shelter. I thought nothing of it, just somebody else waiting for the tram, until I started feeling weird. The streets were quiet and dark and there was nobody else in sight. Just me and this guy, and I started wondering why he chose to stand this close to me when he had so much space to avoid dealing with people. I couldn't comprehend anybody wanting to socialize this late at night, and given that I wasn't very social myself. So I glanced at him, trying not to overthink it. He was a bald-headed, beady-eyed giant, tall and built like a bear, big belly and big arms and legs. I was 5'2" and scrawny, but that wasn't what scared me. It was the fact that he was staring right at me, unblinking and expressionless, not even attempting to look away or act embarrassed. No, this guy wanted me to feel uncomfortable. I instantly felt weak and shaky. Cold shivers ran down my spine. This was not normal. I realized quickly that I was not in a good situation. I couldn't miss the last tram. Walking home was out of the question, and my phone was almost dead. I was a shy kid and I didn't have what it takes to scare the guy away. I knew that, but I had to try at least. I only managed to utter a small "Hi," trying my best to startle him out of whatever he was thinking. But my attempt failed in the face of his silent and threatening aura. He kept staring, no sign of intent to reply. He was enjoying this. Feeling the panic rising inside me, I told myself to stay calm and think rationally. Maybe he didn't hear me. Minutes passed by as stare continued to burn on my skin, and there was no tram in sight. Ignoring him didn't work, so I mustered up the courage to speak once again, this time louder. "What do you want? Stop staring at me." No answer. He definitely heard me this time though. I felt myself start to get angry. I didn't want to let this guy get to me anymore. I didn't want to continue to give him the satisfaction of watching me squirm nervously and pretend that his behavior didn't bother me. I took a deep breath and I forced myself to start thinking. I knew what I can't do. I can't fight him off if he makes a move, and there's nothing that I can say or do that will get him to stop. I didn't know what his intentions were, but I knew that they weren't good. If I tried to walk away, he would probably follow. I could run, but he would most likely catch up to me before I could even tire him out, since his legs weren't much longer than mine. Even if I managed to somehow lose him, walking home through the dark alleys past the junkies and people that were always prowling about, it could land me in an even worse situation. I could pretend to call someone, but he might feel compelled to act much sooner if he felt threatened. So what can I do? The only thing I could realistically be able to do was to try and outsmart him somehow. So I started developing a few plans depending on which tram showed up, trying to confirm whether he was just amusing himself and actually waiting for the tram too, or popped over for other more suspicious reasons, and whether I could get any kind of help. I couldn't let him see where I lived, so if he followed me, I would have to be prepared to employ whatever strategy was available. And for that, I needed to stay rational and aware of my surroundings. While I was still thinking, the first tram showed up. It was the one that I could have taken home, but this one pulled into the depot right in my neighborhood, forcing me to lead him to my home. I hoped that he would board it and leave me be, but he didn't. He just kept watching me carefully. I let the tram go, desperately hoping that it wasn't the last one to head home. He continued to watch, and I sensed that he was quite happy with how things were going. I put up with it for another 15 minutes, trying to focus on another plan of action, I could not pretend that I needed the other tram, the one going to a different area of the city, and just ride to the next station and then get off as soon as possible, so I don't end up too far and miss the tram that I need. This tram showed up next. With my heart in my throat, I boarded it and sat down by the door. He got on it too, but sat by himself in the back, pretty far away from where I was. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking that this might still go well. When the tram reached the next station, I got up and out, not looking back and hoping that it was all over. But when I stepped on the pavement and watched the tram drive away, I couldn't see him in it. I turned my head slowly and was terrified to see him walking towards me, looking slightly upset. He stopped just a few steps away and resumed staring, this time with a clear hint of malice, still though in silence. My vision blurred as I fought back tears of despair. He wasn't going to let me go. The helplessness that I felt was unbearable, but I couldn't cry. I couldn't give up, and I had to find a way. I had to get home tonight. The prospect of what might happen to me any time now if I didn't was becoming all too real. My head was full of unanswered questions, regrets, and horrible scenarios. I wanted so badly to not have to think anymore, to not have to fight back the tears and stay composed. But I knew that this would be his cue to enact whatever messed up plan he had in mind. I couldn't let that happen. And then I saw the final tram approach, the only one that I could take now, and I got on as quickly as my trembling legs would allow me to. When I was in, bright lights enveloping me, my mind snapped out of its nightmarish spiral of fear, and it allowed me a moment of clarity. I had 3 stops to figure this out. I sat down at the front and looked at the driver. He was a frail old man, blissfully unaware of my distress. Getting the driver's attention was a no-go. We passed one stop and there was nobody else waiting to climb aboard. I turned around, fully expecting to see that the psycho had followed me again, but I did not expect him to be sitting right behind me. He wasn't taking any chances. He was making sure that I wouldn't try anything like last time. I shot him a hateful glare and allowed my anger to overcome my fear. I stood up and purposefully walked over to another seat, in the middle of the tram car. I wanted to make it clear that I would not put up with his BS any longer. He got up too and slowly walked up to a spot 2 seats behind and diagonal from me, and then sat down with the tiniest arrogant grin on his face. Already expecting it, I shot up and stood by the middle door instead, determined to keep him on his toes. If I stood right by the door, he wouldn't have any idea which station I planned to get off at. He remained where he was at this time, convinced that I was bluffing. After all, this was really the last tram. There was nothing else that I could possibly do to escape now. He must have reckoned it too, so my defiance was only a funny act to him. This was my chance. I had to take the risk, and it had to work. There were 3 doors on the tram, and they all opened and closed at the same time, and they stayed open for around 5 seconds, before closing again if no buttons were pressed or people detected on the threshold. The next stop, the only one left before mine, came into view. The tram slowed to a stop. The doors open, and I made no move. 5 long seconds passed, and the doors started to close. I bolted out and I ran for it, reaching the back door as fast as I could, and slamming the button to open it again. My whole body was tense with adrenaline. I waited a long and painful second and I jumped back in, keeping my head low and holding my breath and crouching behind the nearest seat. I shut my eyes tightly and exhaled slowly while thanking the gods that I didn't believe in for that button working, and wishing with all my might for him to not have seen me before I got back in. As I was waiting to hear his footsteps approaching, I pictured him frantically looking for me. Was he still on the tram, face screwed up in anger, head turning like a fat and ugly meerkat? Or was he catching his breath on the pavement of the last station, mad eyes searching the darkness for me? As the tram continued its loud journey, banging and clanging in sync with my heartbeat, I dared smile to myself, imagining his face when he realized that he messed up. Hands on my chest, I did my best to stealthily look around the corner and found nobody looking back. I stood up in excitement and threw myself off the foggy back window. There he was, standing alone and victimless in that slowly fading out of sight station, watching me leave him and his vile plans behind. And giving somebody the middle finger never felt so good. When I was younger, I met a man. He was my brother's friend, and he had started living with us after his parents had done some despicable things, and he was left practically alone and a minor still attending school. Though I can't remember if he was emancipated or supposed to be under someone else's care. I was an annoying little sister then, 7 years younger, but I remembered him saying to my brother, "I don't mind at all, she reminds me of mine." What really gets me about this story, this experience, was that I somehow didn't realize until about a month ago how important these events to transpire just might be. For me, those only two events that are unmistakably him, things that he did to me. The first being one night when I was coming down for a glass of water. I began by opening my heavy bedroom door, and I continued down the creaky hallway and the stairs without at all being silent. Just as I had gotten to the bottom platform, I saw him sitting at the computer. I looked at him and he looked at me. I heard an old news report playing of the arrest of his parents. I felt like I was invading his most private moment, a time where he was obviously emotional and raw, and I felt horrible. I paused in that moment because it was such an awkward situation. I just wasn't sure how I was supposed to respond next. But in that moment where I was in my own head, he must have closed the tab and reopened another. He had to have hit play as I imagined and wouldn't have started on its own. And I heard moaning. He just stared at me, and I'm now even deeper in my own head like, is this happening? It must have been an accident. And I finally got the sense in me to go back to my room. I can't remember if I ever told anyone that at the time. I dismissed it as an accident. The second one happened just as I had got out of school. I went up to my room to find my bubble-back TV was missing. My brother took it all the time, either as his own perceived punishment or because he wanted to use it for whatever reason. So I started by storming into his room and demanding where it was. The prong in my screw-on cable cord was getting bad, and it was such a hassle to set up again and again, I was aggravated. He tells me that he has no idea and that he couldn't care less. So confused, I'm now wondering who else would take it. I'm not grounded and my brother doesn't have it. Could it be his friend? I go to his room and I knock. He sounds upset and I ask if he took it. Through the door he said that he did. And going back to my aggravated state, I open it up to see it sitting on the ground, seemingly unused. I then angrily say, "Why did you take my TV?" And before I know it, he's bum rushing me into a wall and he lifts me higher up by the throat. I start yelling at him, yelling in general, trying to fight back, and my mom runs up the stairs and she screams at him. She tells him to let go of me and to get the heck out. As my brother comes out of his room with the most puzzled look on his face like, "What are you doing?" His friend then leaves and I can't remember him coming back and living with us after that. A while later, my brother moved to a new house in the same neighborhood, and for years, he would on and off allow that friend to stay with him. He felt bad for him, thought that he was given an unfair start in life and he wanted to help him. It was before, around this time, that a man in all black would begin terrorizing me. I've written a story about that on here before, so you might possibly recognize it. But it all started on Hallows Eve when I was in 5th grade. It's exhausting to go through all of this again, truthfully. It was something that apparently my mind tried to downplay, dismiss, and forget for a while. But recently in therapy, I was forced to really face it, to realize it was the origin of who I am today, So I'm going to try to briefly explain what happened, without leaving too many details out. There was a knock on the door while I was home alone. It was the middle of the night and I grew up watching Forensic Files, Law & Order, SVU, etc. So I was just naturally like, yeah, I don't want to open this. But like all the dumb characters in horror movies who die in the beginning, I did. I opened the door and no one was there, so I stepped out onto the porch to look and see if they were leaving, because of the moment I had taken to decide, but there was no one there. At first, I thought nothing of it, one of my brother's friends or something. But sometime later, I was sitting on the couch and from there, I saw something dark flash past the kitchen window. It was quick, but I kept thinking, you know, probably just my brother or his friends are playing a prank and maybe it's just nothing. I had no idea, but I was definitely creeped out. As I sat there, I just had this feeling of being watched, like my senses were telling me something was off. But that didn't prepare me for when I looked up, and amidst the slight glow of the backyard, I saw the outline of a man in black standing in the window. In the case of fight or flight, freeze or fawn, I froze. And that was when I watched as he lightly knocked on the window and did a close finger wave like you would to a child. And then he just disappears. And to summarize what happened when my family came home, it wasn't my brother, and they were more than convinced that it was a prank. There are more details surrounding these more important events and what had transpired between them and my previously written story. But what matters is that it never really stopped after that. Any time that I was home alone or it was late at night, he was there, dressed entirely head to toe in black, so I've never been so sure of his age, race, and nothing. There were phone calls that started at some point, but they would only be silence or a quick breath. And even though I lived in a house of people, it seemed that it only happened to me. My mom had picked up these silent phone calls, but there she would hang up quickly, and she assumed nothing of it. And then the next real event happened. I was again home alone. It was a Friday, I remember, because my friends were at a school football game that I didn't have a ride for. Around that time, things had kind of slowed down with the man. It seemed like he was coming around and just staring at my house from the backyard far less often. So I was actually feeling pretty relaxed at the time, considering everything. I was watching the TV show House, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dark, sudden flash. My stomach dropped. My heart was pounding like a drum. Everything went quiet. I had muted the TV and it was almost like a who blinks first scenario, because whoever or whatever it was making no noise. An eternity had passed in a series of seconds to minutes, until reality came back with the sound of a doorknob. I heard it jiggling. From deafening silence to hearing the unexpected sound of the figurative pin dropping, my stress response chose correctly for the first time and I ran. I grabbed my phone, left everything else, and went right out of the door. I didn't stop until I reached the other side of town. There, I remember laying underneath the streetlight, thinking that this was it, the day it was all building up to. I had been sleeping with a knife under my pillow, being unbelieved for years at this point, and it all led to this. It was either an attempt or he wasn't done with me yet. He could be coming at any moment or his very next opportunity. I took those seconds to try to gather my thoughts, catch my breath, and then I called my mom. She was out at the bar with her boyfriend at the time, so they picked me up and we all went back home. Her boyfriend made us stay in the car, and the only thing different than how we had left it was the back door being wide open. It was a complicated antique door and not easily opened even when it was unlocked. So that should have been a huge worry in and of itself, but of course, they dismissed that too. They said that it must have been the cat. Seriously, the most concerning thing for me, though, was that nothing was taken. Most people would naturally first assume it must have been a burglar, but no, nothing was taken. and at the time there was just a basement full of expensive tools and equipment, as my mom and her boyfriend were flipping houses. And yet not a single thing was gone. There was more than enough time too. From my leaving the house to coming back had to be about 30 minutes or so. Sometime after that event, my neighbor then experienced something too. While sitting on his patio with his girlfriend, a man in all black started approaching them from the yard of an abandoned home. My neighbor told him to stop and he didn't. And then he pulled out his gun, said to stop, and he didn't. So my neighbor then fired at the ground, and in that moment, he must have decided that it wasn't worth it because he ran off, tripping over a branch on his way out. That was around the same time that he stopped coming around. But now, as I previously mentioned, therapy has forced me to face this and try to process it. During the time of these events, naturally, I spent so much time wondering who it could be and why. What, to kidnap me, to kill me, to do something unspeakable. But I never got any answers from the world, time, or myself. Until possibly now. My brother's friend. After all these events that had transpired, and while sleeping in my brother's car, he did something horrifying. He set himself up along a levee. At first, just himself and a notebook, and he would watch people as they walked by. They went along with their day, unsuspecting, as he would make a record of everyone that he saw. Hair color, what they were wearing, race, gender, age, range, how long they were there, how often, with someone, or were they alone. And then one day, with a knife in hand, he pulled a woman off the levee and into a nearby wooded area. She was able to fight him off and she got away, but not unscathed. He had slashed her arm, and I can't even imagine the horror she went through in those moments. Following that, I'm not sure how they found him, or how they knew about the notebook, but the only address they had from him was my brother's and ours. State and local police, as well as, I believe, possibly a U.S. Marshal. It was a branch of law enforcement I remember being high up and unusual. They came to my door in a sudden swarm. They had banged at my door as I had opened. A cop slammed me against the door with his forearm and told me to stay back. I was absolutely clueless to what was happening, but it started to click when my brother's friend was being walked out in handcuffs from my brother's home. They sat him upon the stairs, feet away from police canines, and I could hear them asking where his backpack is. A man said, "If you don't tell us where it is, we're going to search both of these houses." I think that he sincerely cared about my brother, as my brother did for him for all those years. And so I assume that's why he then divulged that it was under the dining room table at my brother's home. They then went, collected it, and simply left. I don't know what happened to him, but now years later I wonder if everything that happened to me was because of him. The way that he wrote down those people's every movement terrifies me, yet almost solidifies in a way my suspicion. What if the only reason he knew when I was truly home alone, our routines, was because he has a notebook on me too?